The information flow is endless, and with so many sensational headlines, changing policies, and market fluctuations, it can be tough to keep up with what's most relevant to you as a real estate investor. In Boardroom Brief, we endeavor to discuss and provide our point of view and insights on relevant topics that matter to Greybrook, our investors, and the broader real estate community. Our goal is to provide you with expert opinions in 20 minutes or less.
Sasha, hello. How's it going?
It's going great. How are you?
Great. I'm doing well. Okay, so today, listen, sometimes when I think about the government, various levels of government, I ask myself, what does the government love second to taking my money? And I think it's creating useless acronyms. And so the provincial government just announced recently that they will be enacting their new PPS 2024, the Provincial Policy Statement of 2024. So, lots of changes there. A few, things we'll note through our chat. But essentially, they're consolidating PPS 2020 and the growth plan. Yeah. And believe it or not, they actually retained someone to do a study on how many hours and pages of administrative work they'll be saving. And wouldn't you know it, it's 6,000 hours of saved. I wonder how many hours it took to calculate the 6,000 hours that they're saving.
It's always good for elections, right? Having that tidbit.
So some of the things they're talking about is easing up the ability to develop employment land. They're talking about how they want to make it easier for municipalities to make more land unlocked for development. Without going too granular into what the PPS 2024 is actually going to do, with these policy changes that seem to always be coming out, do you think these are the types of things that really move the needle on our ability as a development firm to deliver more housing to the market? Or do you think it's a much broader subject with variables that go well beyond policy?
First of all, you think about government a lot, which is wonderful. I think we have to in our line of work. As much as I try not to, it's something that is our day-to-day. Let me kind of answer your question this way. I think as it relates to any policy in any industry, part of it is the framework of the policy and what it sets out to do. I'd say the bigger part of it is the interpretation and execution of the policy, because it could say one thing, and depending on how it's executed, it could be positive, it could be negative, it could be neutral. I think that as it relates to this particular amendment at the provincial level, it was aimed at the right place. And it's always perplexed me, if I'm being honest, as to how, things like the Green Belt, for example, that, was constituted 30 years ago and hasn't changed, really, materially. Sure. But everything around it's changed. The way cities have grown has changed. The population forecasts have changed. Where employment has migrated has changed. All of these things have changed. So I've always thought that some of these policies that are static should be looked at with much more frequency than they are. Now, this last cycle, from the time the provincial government became a conservative government, taking over from the Liberals prior to them, there's been a focus on housing. And it started back in 2018. We were in an overheated market, and Kathleen Wynne's government introduced a whole slew of demand side things like foreign buyer taxes and different things aimed at the demand side, because the idea was, if we have one home for every 10 people, let's create disincentive for 8 of those people, and now we have less scarcity. The conservative government addressed the problem from the opposite side, which was, okay, well, if we have 10 people in a house for 10 people, then let's create 10 houses for 10 people, right? So let's stimulate the supply side. They both have merit. One is, I think, a lot easier than the other. The easier one being tax and disincentive, the harder one being supply side, because policy framework is one thing, but then it takes a lot of people and multiple levels of government to be able to actually execute that. So I'd say that the provincial policy statement amendment here for 2024 is aimed in the right direction. It's looking at taking parcels of land that are closer to services, closer to how municipalities have grown, and thinking about expanding urban boundaries to include those lands because logical and cost effective and quicker. to build housing on those lands than it is on some tract of land that's 10 miles away from the urban boundary and existing services, right? Another example is creating employment lands, creating areas of intensification around transit hubs and things like that. So all of these, I think, are aimed in the right direction toward improvement. I think the impact, however, is going to be felt many, many years from now, because I don't think it's a light switch solution, because the policy is one piece, and then from there it's the interpretation of this policy, it's how the industry interprets it, developers and the like, as well as how government officials at the municipal level choose to take their own interpretation of their little, in the case of Toronto, how does Toronto fit within the greater framework of the province? And the execution of that is still another layer, right? It requires expertise, it requires technical expertise, it requires staff, it requires resources. And I think some of those are in short supply. Like, we have projects, for example, as you know, all over the province in southern Ontario, obviously primarily. There's municipalities where they don't have the technical expertise to evaluate certain proposals and secondary plans and things of that sort. There's parts of the city where they haven't been able to maintain the planning staff required to move applications through the process. So I think that there's multiple challenges associated with increasing the growth and supply of housing to the level that we need to be able to even begin to meet the demand. And I think those challenges are multifaceted, because it's different levels of government that are resourced differently, that interpret things differently, and where the rubber hits the road, it's there. Like when we make an application for a condo, for example, in Toronto, or a housing development in Shelburne, we're doing so with the council in that specific region. And all of the execution occurs there. Notwithstanding what might be in the broader framework of the province, they're making decisions that are based on their needs, what they interpret their needs to be, at least
at a local level.
At a local level. And sometimes they're thinking ahead a decade or more, and sometimes they're thinking about right now. Like, what do my people want? What do my constituents want? How do they feel about these things? So because of all of these reasons, I simply don't believe that, notwithstanding policy changes like the PPS 2024 are for sure a step in the right direction. It's just not something that's like a snap your fingers solution. So we're still going to see a lot of bumps on the road as it relates to being able to create supply. And as an industry, I think we just have to kind of make the best with what's there and block and tackle every issue as we go, depending on the submarket that we work in.
And so, I mean, to your point on our ability to adapt to these things, it seems like right now there's essentially two stakeholders that are like prime and center in this, is the provincial level and the municipal level, right? One's sort of trickling down to the next. And the provincial levels made essentially this bold statement of 1.5 million homes by 2031, right? So you do some quick arithmetic in your math, we're trying to pump out 200,000 homes a year, give or take. What role does the private sector play in sort of being at the table when, these broad sort of kind of promises are being made? Like, is this even feasible at the end of the day? I think we're all aligned as stakeholders to want to do it, right? I think we all want to deliver the housing, all levels of government, private sector. But, I know there's associations that sort of speak on our behalf and stuff, but what role do you think private sector plays in sort of collaborating with municipal and provincial before an application even goes in, right? To just say, hey guys, like, we're a player in this game, and I don't know.
The impact, I'm not sure, because when I saw some of the changes in the provincial policy statement, and even prior to this, and some of the other changes that have been made since kind of 2021 or two, we were party to some of those discussions. So if you remember, the provincial government put sort of an Ontario affordability task force together that was run by a gentleman named Jake Lawrence, who's the chair of Scotiabank, and there were private sector stakeholders included in the working groups, and I was one of those stakeholders. So I felt like for the first time they listened. I had spent some time with the prior administration, and sometimes you'd think you're giving them input and others are giving them input, and then the policy comes out and you're like,
It's nothing.
did you hear any of what we talked about, right?
Yeah.
I think for the first time when I saw the first draft of the recommendations, I felt that a lot of what the private sector from an industry perspective had to offer was captured. But it goes through a political apparatus, right? Because function number one is get all the input from all the relevant stakeholders that actually know how to execute, right? And that's what they did. They went to banks and developers and investors like us and got all that input on how to try and address some of these issues on the supply side, whether it be focused on policy, whether it be focused on the plumbing, as I call it, like the process, or even broad things like, we always talk about, or politicians like to talk about how the fact that we don't have a lot of rental housing, purpose-built rental housing. Yet I was surprised by how little attention had been paid on how it's capitalized, how it's financed, who builds it, who buys it, what their motivating factors are. And none of these things lend themselves particularly well to purpose-built rental. Like, it's not that developers haven't thought about the fact that, oh man, the city's growing, we have 6 million people, low vacancy, we should really build some purpose-built rentals. It's that the business opportunity has not been sufficient to attract the type of capital that has been required. And there's a number of reasons for that, which we won't get into today, but this is just to illustrate a point. I feel like all of this was addressed, but then when you saw the raw recommendations, the next part of the process is for the politicians and bureaucrats along with them to try and prioritize and synthesize this into legislation that can actually be passed.
Yes.
Right? Because that is a process in and of itself.
Sure.
And you're not going to be able to make broad sweeping changes because there's other stakeholders and there's opposition and all these things. So when it goes through that political apparatus and ends up with the legislation that sees the light of day, it's usually a very watered down version of
What you guys put forward.
yeah, what we had sort of identified as issues. So in a lot of, sometimes I'll sit there and say, man, if it was up to the private sector, like we would just go and solve all these problems.
Yeah.
But I know it's more complicated
Sure.
than that. And, I was in Europe recently, and, you go to Europe and you admire the architecture and the 200-year-old buildings, 500-year, depending on where you're at. And you think to yourself, man, this is so great. I'd love to be here all the time. And then you realize that, we are a new city, relatively speaking, here in Toronto and North America generally. And we often battle with historical conservatory and things like that. And when they win, sometimes we think, man, that doesn't make sense. Like, we should for sure be able to build this development. And then you go to Europe and you appreciate the fact that at some point they won. And this is still standing. So I think there's that balance, right? And so while it's easy to be a private sector constituent and look at these things and say, I think I can solve these problems, I also know it's more complicated than that, and there's got to be a balance. And I think where the current policy is, I think it does strike that right balance. It found its way into a form that I think does move the needle. I don't think it moves the needle quickly, right? But we got to take some steps to be able to take a leap. And I do really think that as compared to prior administrations, like this administration has actually done a couple things really well. They've shone the light on the supply issue being the primary issue, first and foremost. They've got the public now through media and other ways to acknowledge this, which in turn makes the process easier, because when you're at the municipal level fighting for more density or whatever the case may be, the public opposition has muted, right? Because people are now looking at it and saying, man, we need more housing. So maybe we shouldn't oppose it every time it's being proposed. So I think it's done a lot of good, and they have moved the needle forward. But I do think that, it's a multifactorial problem that will probably take a generation to even lessen that scarcity gap. And I always come back to the fact that, if I was totally altruistic and looking at how to solve the housing problem and create the ability for everybody to be able to buy a home, that'd be one thing. But at the end of the day, we're also an investor. And part of this being a great investment strategy and an investment strategy that has sustainability and longevity, notwithstanding points of volatility is the fact that scarcity exists. It will not be displaced, and it's probably going to be that way for a long time.
And so, I mean, it sounds like at the very least things are moving in the right direction. I think even anecdotally, with the prior administration, my old colleagues and I used to make jokes that, the NIMBYs, not in my backyard, were always the loudest people in the room, right? And you had so much sort of frustration at the development level because they're the loudest voice in the room. You had this sort of bottleneck of construction. You've been doing this 20 plus years now. Can you think in the past of a policy change that you think had, in your career as a highlight, that had like a really material impact on the ability to sort of move things through the pipe? And is there any learnings that, present day administration can take from that?
Well, I mean, the one that comes to mind is the reason we sort of really zeroed in on this business. Like when Greybrook first was conceived, real estate was a component of what we did, but it was broader than that. And then we really zeroed in on real estate because what happened, I can't remember if it was in the early 2000s or late 90s, but there was a change to the official plan of the City of Toronto, which allowed for high density residential development within a certain peripheral core. Like before, it was we're following the trajectory of a typical American city, right? The downtown core is where people go to work, and then come 5 o'clock, you could hear crickets in the downtown core of Pittsburgh, for example, because everybody lives in the suburbs. Toronto kind of turned that on its head and embraced more of a New York live, work, play 24/7 community by allowing high density residential development in the core. That was a huge change, which shaped, the landscape that we have today. Like if you look at a picture of Toronto in the 90s, it was like a pancake minus the financial sector, like King Street, Bay Street. Today, it's obviously very different. So that would be kind of the major one. Changes that kind of came along the way, I feel like they've always been, I don't want to call them peripheral, but they haven't really made meaningful, dramatic impact, at least not to my recollection as we sit here today. I think that this time around, I am seeing actual progress. And, we have projects, for example, in parts of the city where parking that's forever and historically always been a requirement. And in development, parking's quite expensive. So when you look at your profitability and your pro forma, the less parking you have, the better, usually, if you can market the units for sale without parking. Well, as public transit improves, as accessibility improves, some of these downtown core sites don't require parking. Before, it was a fight with the city to lessen the amount of spots. Now they're almost encouraging you to not have parking, which of course is great economically, again, provided you can market those units. That's an example of, I think, a 180 in terms of where the city's thought about making changes. Another example is, we have projects, 2 or 3 of them in the core high-rise, where they were under construction or already approved in some cases, where we were able to increase the density as a result of a much less stringent process. So not reopening a whole new application, but rather a much quicker window to be able to increase that density. And the city actually welcomed it, right? So that was a foreign concept before. Like, you'd always be fighting about density and you'd give them all the reasons that we need it. Maybe we wouldn't have as much of a scarcity issue. And of course you get opposition. Now it's kind of turned around. So that's another 180. So I think now more than before, I've seen actual tangible changes, but the scarcity and the undersupply that we have as a result of a decade plus of hypergrowth from a population growth perspective and a bottleneck of supply has created a level of scarcity which I never want to say too little too late because it's a starting point, but it'll take a decade, 2 decades for that. I don't know that it'll ever reach equilibrium. I don't want to say ever, but certainly not in our investment time horizon. But for sure that you'll start seeing that scarcity become less of a factor. So I would say that this administration particularly has probably made more impactful changes than before.
Yeah, because it's such a long-term sort of policy, if you will, the municipalities have to adopt it and actually implement it, right? And every municipality has a different view on what, kind of healthy development is, right? So they have to interpret it in their own way. And then we also have to sort of assume and hope that future administrations, both municipally and provincially, are on the same wavelength, because you've seen this before, and I think you made a great example with like the Wynne government flipping to the Conservative government, where it was basically let's focus on, let's compress the demand side and more focus on let's expand the supply side, right? So as long as that sort of mentality continues, I think hopefully it'll catch up. Thank you, Sasha. Really appreciate your time.